You heard several sessions on industry, agriculture, and since we had ministers and bureaucrats with us, so our job as journalists is to play the devil's advocate. So we were sort of, raising questions which were rather uncomfortable to some extent. But let me point out something. I came to Odisha for the first time in my life in the year 1995-96 when I was still a graduate student working on my dissertation, and Odisha was part of it. And what I saw, the picture at that time, and what I see today, I came again in the year 2000, and at that time, the super cyclone had come, and I traveled from all the way from Bhubaneswar to Dhenkanal. And the picture was sort of a bit of a tragedy. All the trees on the road were sort of fallen. The people I spoke to, almost about unofficial estimates say almost about 30,000 people had died in that cyclone. Jagat Singhpur alone, the district, about 8,000 deaths had taken place in that year. So the picture was rather, what I would say, not a very happy picture. And today when I come 17 years later to the state, having sort of to some extent researched the state through the state of state data and some of the resource persons who are sitting in the audience, I think it's a story of extraordinary transformation. In fact, I would say that in eastern India, we did not have this kind of transformation at all. For example, take the case of West Bengal. In the morning, I was raising West Bengal and Gujarat as examples, as counter examples to Orissa. But the truth is, West Bengal had a longer political stability, for example, under the communists from 1977. In fact, even before 77, the left front government was in power. And it continued for a very long time, in fact, till the late 90s. And yet, you did not see that kind of extraordinary transformation of West Bengal that you see in Orissa in the last 17 years. And let me just point out, let me just recap some of the figures, which are what I think tells the story of this extraordinary transformation. In the morning, you heard that from the 1950s to 1980s, Odisha's growth rate was really low, 2.77. Then for the next period, for the next 10 years, it was about 4%. And then suddenly you see a doubling, or in fact more than a doubling of economic growth rate. And these are not simply figures. This hides behind an extraordinary story. Take the case of industry, services, agriculture. If you take these three figures and look at the GVA of the state, in fact, Odisha is a rare state in the country. It's among the 3 states in the country where industry and services figures almost match in the GVA, almost 42%, 42%. That's a rare example in India, because remember, in India, the transformation from agriculture jumped into services, bypassing industry. Whereas in the case of Orissa, that doesn't seem to be the case. Of course, Orissa owns almost sort of 20% of the mineral wealth of the country. But despite that, we have had states like Jharkhand, for example, owning enormous amount of mineral wealth. But we haven't seen this kind of development. Same thing with Chhattisgarh. So in that sense, Odisha's story is actually the story of an extraordinary transformation in the industrial sector, especially in manufacturing, again, an area where India hasn't had comparative advantage. In fact, whenever we compare India to China, the story is extraordinary manufacturing turnaround in China and a sort of failure in India. India's growth is largely driven to a great extent by the services sector growth. And that is good, but a more robust picture comes if you have a manufacturing revolution going on, because it increases, if the manufacturing revolution continues, it lifts people out of poverty, it creates a lot of demand in the economy, and it produces a lot of jobs in the economy. And that is why this manufacturing transformation that began in Orissa, if it goes to its logical conclusion, Orissa is bound to become what one would call the star of the East. And given the fact that development today is more eastward bound, the Southeast Asian growth, extraordinary transformation in China, if you have this coast of Orissa, this coast of India, the Bay of Bengal coast of India, sort of driving the engine of growth, it's going to be a great story because this is the hub where at one time, in fact, economists point out that in the 17th century, 18th century, this entire belt, this Bay of Bengal, Indian Ocean, and the Arabian Sea used to have a trade. The volume of trade over here was double that of Atlantic and Pacific. So it was the Asian model of growth, which completely went out of the window during the colonial period. And when it started back in India, it largely started in the so-called Western states. So if we have Orissa, West Bengal, Andhra, Tamil Nadu leading the growth, and maybe the hinterland states, the Bimaru states leading the growth in the next phase, you're heading towards an extraordinary transformation story. And that is what we try to some extent, debate in the morning. Let's get back to Orissa and see what are some of the seminal, achievements in this rather 17 years period. I mean, one, we've been talking since the morning, 9.2% growth, an extraordinary growth in the period, despite the fact that it is true in India, between 2003 and 2012, you had a boom period. After 2012, there has been a little bit of decline in that big boom. But it is not only because of the boom, because Odisha's story is that its industrialization record is much, much better than in India in this period. It has done much better than the country. In agriculture, Ashok Dalwai pointed out, and figures show, that there has been doubling of farm incomes in the last 10 years. Now, that is something, again, extraordinary. Why is that? Because in order to double farm incomes in 10 years, you need something to the tune of 7 to 8% growth rate per year in agriculture. Normally in agriculture, you will find 2% growth rate, 1% growth rate. So to have a sort of continuous growth rate of 7 to 8% in agriculture for a decade is extraordinary transformation. So again, the doubling of farm incomes, and as the agriculture minister in the morning pointed out, enormous production of cereals and other goods, now sort of diversification process has begun. So these are things which demarcate Orissa completely from some of the other states in that area. In fact, let's go and do a little bit of a disaggregated picture. Kalahandi at one time was known for its hunger and poverty and famine, and today it's considered the rice bowl of Orissa, right? In fact, same thing when it comes to, for example, quite a lot of these southern districts. You'll see, I don't want to sort of jump the gun because we'll be giving out the awards, but many of them have actually done very, very well in other sectors, in education, in health, and in quite a number of other sectors as well. Economic growth rate happens, not always it ends up denting poverty. In many parts of the world, you have seen economic growth rates over a period of time, led by technology, led by enormous amount of investment of capital, but not denting poverty in a major way. In the two Asian countries, China and India, their extraordinary growth in this period shows that the moment the growth picks up, it dents poverty, creates a new middle class, creates a lower middle class out of the rural poor. And in that, again, Odisha has done extraordinarily well. The poverty levels in Odisha pre-2000 was 60%. Today, according to the Planning Commission data, in fact, the data we used showed about 37, 38%. But I looked at the Planning Commission records showing Odisha's poverty levels below 32%. I mean, that's like 21% transformation in just 5 years, poverty levels in rural Odisha, about 12% in urban Odisha. Again, I would say an extraordinary transformation of removing poverty. Farmer incomes doubling, and the direct correlation, farmers' income doubling in 10 years, because the allocation in agriculture doubled in 5 years between 2012, 2013 to 2017. So again, look at the transfer. The moment you allocate more money in agriculture, the farmer income sort of kind of doubles, and that is something not very simple in the case of Odisha. What are the causes for such an extraordinary transformation? Both, as we said, in industry largely, partly in services sector, maybe not as extraordinary as Karnataka, but still quite good. And in agriculture, as we are pointing out, not as extraordinary as Madhya Pradesh, but still fairly good. And most economists that I've talked to and we researched, they say that One reason for this, the cause of this is political stability. Political stability for the last 17 years, the Biju Janata Dal government has moved higher and higher mandate every election, number one. Number two, massive industrial investment, both public and in the private investment. Again, Odisha is among the top 3-4 states where you have seen in recent years enormous amount of investment, especially, of course, in this case, in steel and bauxite and a few certain industries. And there has been protests in certain areas and things of that sort. But still, I would say, Dr. Santosh Panda points out in one of his articles, extraordinary fiscal discipline. In fact, in Odisha, you would have almost like, today you have a surplus in terms of the, the fiscal characteristics of the state, which used to be negative in the past. Effective disaster management. Great example, compare the super cyclone that I talked about in the beginning of my lecture in 1999, compare it to 2013 when Cyclone Feline took place. I mean, 30,000 deaths versus 44 deaths. 1 million people were evacuated, in fact, very, very effectively. So within 13 years, Odisha seemed to have learned sort of how to handle disaster management. And in fact, economists have argued that that shows, that kind of, micromanagement in terms of disaster has had a positive effect on the GDP growth. So that again is a extraordinary story. Let me not take up too much time. Let me just point out that when we started the study of Odisha, we looked at all the 30 districts. In fact, we've done in the other states. And what, in fact, came out of that study, which we'll talk about in the evening also, is that despite the differences, I mean, Odisha is a typical coastal state with 485 kilometers of coastline, and normally, all over the world, you find coastal districts doing much better than the hinterland. Take the case of America, for example. California, coast of Pacific, or the sort of New England states, Boston, down to Washington, New York. These were the basic drivers of growth in America for a long time. And the reason being, these were the coastal belts. The hinterland, in between in America did not do very well, except with a few exceptions. So it's a similar growth story in this country. The coastal states have led development in this country compared to the so-called hinterland Bimaru states. And within Odisha, we find that the coastal districts have largely done better than the, let's say, hinterland districts. But again, when you look at the awards that we have distributed, you will find that hardly about 7 to 8 awards out of 28 has actually gone to the coastal districts. Many of the other districts have done extraordinary performance in education, in health, in infrastructure, in other indices, including in industry and agriculture. So what I'm saying is, it's an all-inclusive, spread-out development in Odisha, again, in the last 17 years. And when I'm comparing, I'm always doing a temporal comparison in the sense what we call in economics the before and after model. Before 2000, after 2000. In fact, yesterday I was talking to some politicians, and I just asked them this question. Some of them will be here this afternoon. I said, sir, how does Chief Minister Naveen Patnaik compare to Biju Patnaik, the great leader? And most of them were a little older of age, and they loved Biju Patnaik. So they said, well, he was an extraordinary leader. So I said, but look at the record. The record shows otherwise. What is the record? 17 years of long political stability, winning 4 elections in a row, each election with an extraordinary record compared to the previous election. Whereas even though he was a great leader, he was a charismatic leader, perhaps much more social than the present chief minister, but there was political instability. Most of the governments under the Congress party never lasted for more than a couple of years. In fact, the story is extraordinary, where all the Congress leaders who became chief ministers of Odisha at one time, and one can go around naming, most of you are aware of that, they actually left the Congress party. And most of them came out of the Congress party. And today, one was tracing down most of these Congress families in the state. Their children are all in the Biju Janata Dal. So it's been a systematic decline of the Congress in this state, and extraordinary rise of the Biju Janata Dal, especially from 1997 under the leadership of Chief Minister Naveen Patnaik. And despite his sort of, he sort of is not a very, he sort of goes into the background. He's not very, I mean, people say he's not very articulate, which is not true, but he's a man of few words. But in terms of action, if you see, both in terms of great election machinery created by the Biju Janata Dal. In fact, many of the leaders of Biju Janata Dal that I spoke to yesterday were telling me, we are not only great in getting votes, we're also great in poaching players. They were telling me how they have eaten into the Congress party. They have even tried to poach the BJP. So what we see the BJP doing in the center, the Biju Janata Dal has done in the state. So what I'm saying is both in terms of political stability and in terms of economic transformation, it has been an extraordinary result. Of course, all trajectories have their limits, and that's what we were trying to do in the morning, point out some of the limits, point out how the hinterland states could do better in the future, point out how environmental sustainability could be better in the future. And with that, you'll obviously see the entire story. It will tell you the story down to the district level, how certain stories within some of the districts has been rather extraordinary. So with that, I close my remarks. Thank you very much.